All right. Welcome, Nathan Baschez, to the show.
How's it going? Thank you for having me.
Good. It's been too long. I feel like it's at least several years since we made one of these together. So we have been reading your latest stuff, and you talk about your product philosophies. And I think one of the things in your product philosophies that always comes out is that you seem very grounded and in the moment, is kind of how I would describe it. I think a lot of people get these very lofty, long distance, far visiony things, and you're kind of like, this is what I want to do right now. At least that's how I read it. Is that an accurate assessment, or is that how it sounds in your head?
I think it's both. Like, I think definitely when it comes to like a first version, the main thing that I'm focused on and excited about is just whatever I'm working on at the time in a very detailed way. Like, how do I make this interaction feel really good or just make sense to people? What's the right way to lay out this page, or what, like all those kind of things is like definitely where my head is at. It's just details, right? At the same time, I definitely am motivated by abstract long-term conceptions of like what could be. And I think the challenging thing sometimes is to connect the dots in a way that makes sense, because, so I think a common challenge is to have some long run idea or vision that it's like, well, what's the step that makes sense now, and to really perform that step in a excellent way, is difficult. And I think a lot of companies and people, definitely myself included, get into problems when it's like, it's great to have the abstract long-term vision, but it doesn't, you're sort of translate it in a clumsy way, because you're trying to like force something that like, there's a part of you that knows like, this doesn't really make that much sense right now, but it's kind of, it feels cool because you're kind of LARPing, like being at the destination a little bit,
Right.
You're like, yeah, like we've got a platform and an API and a developer ecosystem. It's like, nope, hardly anybody writes on your thing yet, so you should just focus on making the writing experience good. That's always the sequencing thing is maybe the one way to make it a little bit more crisp. That it's a challenge for sure.
Right,
but I'm not immune from the long-term vision thing.
So you're trying to like suppress that sometimes to sort of be able to make something that's useful today.
Yeah. And actually, I do think one thing that worked really well about Lex is, for anybody listening who doesn't know, it's like Google Docs, but it has this AI baked in. So when you type plus plus plus, it gives you a paragraph of text. And the way to use it is really just to write as you normally would. And then when you get stuck, which happens to me all the time when I'm writing, it's just really nice to have this thing to fall back on. And it's not even about if it's right or not, or if you're going to end up using that text necessarily or not. Sometimes you can. Sometimes it is really good. But more often, it just gives you something to think about, and it helps you kind of consider angles that you wouldn't otherwise consider, and it's not just about writing faster or cheaper. It's also about writing better, I think. So anyway, one thing I think that worked well about it is that when I was building it, there was definitely way less of the grand vision thing. I wasn't like, oh, this is going to be a big business or whatever. I just wanted to use it, and I didn't really anticipate anything beyond that. And I thought it'd be cool. Obviously there's like a part of me that was like, I think this would be a really cool thing. But I think that helped kind of like tame the part of my brain that might psych me out or cause me to make like subpar decisions, where it's like you're kind of bringing in something that's a part of the long-term vision, even though it doesn't make that much sense today.
Right.
Yeah.
And you also seem to, I think in your piece you wrote about how you kind of have gotten comfortable, or you advise people to get comfortable with not like doing something that's small and doesn't feel super long-term visiony, because it just helps you sort of get making and get sort of that conversation going.
Yeah, I think that there's approaching any individual sort of like project or product, like that's all there is, sort of like there's like a myopic frame around it. And then there's a more healthy approach, which is I'm developing a process, a skill set that's going to enable me to create a whole bunch of things. And I don't know which one is going to be the thing. And that's not to say I just put out a ton of kind of crappy, sloppy things, just like spray and pray or whatever. It's just to say that realistically, you need to build a lot in order to build anything well. And it's hard to, even when you build something well, it doesn't always, there's a lot of factors that cause something to succeed or not. And it's really complex. And so given the fact that repetition is, practice makes permanent or perfect, if you are practicing in a good way. And given the fact that it's hard to know how people will respond until you just get it in front of people, it's better just to make a bunch of stuff and focus on your process than to put too much pressure on any one thing. And then when something turns out really well, pounce on it, and keep going with it, to the extent that it makes sense to. But, to think of it as a long-term process and skill that you're building more so than a myopic, like here's the one project and it must succeed at all costs.
And do you think that you're bringing along, a bunch of people that know you and like you and trust you from other work that you've done to the new thing, or does it feel like it's a little bit more of a de novo moment that you've sort of lucked into with the creation of this particular thing?
It's both, like for sure there's like familiar faces and names, like, in the Lex, like, email and on Twitter and stuff like that. But then there's also a lot of people who I'm like, how did you find this? Like, that's cool. It's like a teacher, somebody who runs like a nonprofit for animals in New Jersey. And it's like, wow, like there's a whole bunch of different types of people that get value out of this thing that are completely outside of my Twitter sphere.
That's
and
cool.
I mean, there's a lot more Lex signups than there are Nathan Twitter followers. So I guess like by definition, it's both. I do think that it helps to have a sort of like friendly group of people that can try, things that you make sort of day one. It's by no means necessary, but it's a nice side effect of doing it, doing this kind of thing, over and over for like about a decade. So yeah, I think that is nice for sure.
You mentioned some of the unexpected people using Lex. Like, what are some of those moments that stood out as like surprising use cases you might not have thought of, or even like in your own experience using it? I like in your piece how you mentioned sort of, even if not every fact that it prompts you with is accurate, it at least gives you something to react to. Like, do you have any examples that kind of come to mind of that, or people using it for interesting things?
Yeah, I mean, on the interesting thing front, there's a ton of different, like there's people who have e-commerce businesses. Like there's somebody who like bought an e-commerce business and all the product descriptions were kind of like meh, and so they're using it to rewrite all those descriptions. And it's nice because there's a bunch of SKUs and you want to get through it like kind of quickly. And still they're editing the output of the AI, right? But it's just nice to have a tool that helps you do that pretty quickly. And then there's, people writing like LP letters for people who are like investors or whatever. There's people who are, there's students, there's teachers. That was the funny thing is like people always talk about, in school, like, how's it going to work with like students cheating? Like the teachers are using it too. You better believe. Perhaps even more so because like, it's time consuming work to be a teacher, to have all those students that you got to write, feedback for or whatever. Yeah, exactly. There's just, it's at this point, it's not, I wouldn't say there's anything that's like surprising because I just have this prior that it's like people are using it kind of like for everything. Yeah. And in some ways that's actually a big problem, right? Because, I think there's basically Lex is going through a transition now from, a V1 that I launched that was like, it's totally open-ended. It's Google Docs-ish, but with AI built in. To like, okay, what's it actually going to become, right? Because every text box is going to have AI baked in it, and a lot already do. And there's already plugins that can put AI in every text box. So like, why would someone choose this text box? And so that's the whole thing that I'm focused on now, and it's gonna narrow, I think, over time and become less like totally a million people using it for a million different reasons,
Yeah.
How will that? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to mention Evan's piece because DK sent me Evan's piece on like 6 theories about AI. And at the end, he was basically saying you already have tons of Lex copycats, a course teaching people how to make their own Lex. Like, obviously, a lot of this will keep happening. So, it's a really interesting kind of question of like, where do you narrow and get super specialized for like maybe one kind of writer or one kind of use case? And I'm curious, do you have any like inklings of places you think are interesting to go deeper on or underserved?
Definitely. I mean, and this actually goes back to the original inspiration for building Lex, which is, I was just annoyed with Google Docs for how I use it. Working on every I'm in Google Docs on the writing side or on the editing side, like every day. And the list of gripes kind of like kept growing. And I really think that for writers, or just people who have to create writing, as a part of their job. And what I mean by create writing is create something that you're going to publish, right? Like probably on the internet, not print out. There's a sequence of like kind of painful steps, and Google Docs has little paper cuts every step of the way, because it is a tool that's used by millions of different people for millions of different reasons. I think that it's kind of like in design how it felt to use Photoshop before Figma was around. It was pretty good in a lot of ways. Like it felt fine. And then when Figma came out and Sketch came out, it was like, well, this is obviously better. This is more for what I need it to be. And the goal with Lex is over time for it to feel more and more that way for writers. So the tricky thing is with designers, it's very clear. There's like a job description of a person who does a pretty specialized act, whereas like everybody writes, So what I mean by writers is, people who create content that is meant to be published and go through some sort of review process, and it's going to end up on a URL on the internet that's like publicly accessible probably, or in some cases maybe just be shipped privately, like internal to a company, but there's the idea is that there's an audience and that there's some stakes and that it's important and it should be good. And so, there's I kind of think of three big categories basically of opportunity to make that experience better. One is, and AI is a part of all of them. It's not one of the categories, right? So one is the drafting experience, like as the person who's originating the document, like what do you do, right? How does that work? Two is the feedback and review and collaboration process of, okay, it's not shipped yet, but you want to get some information from other people before you ship it and get sort of buy-in potentially or approval. And then the third category is kind of a layer almost beneath both of those, which is like, I think there's a huge opportunity to make something that's more of a platform and more extensible and plug-inable. This is something that Figma has done incredibly well. And technically Google Docs has like an API and plugins and all that kind of stuff, but it's very underdeveloped. And I also think that the opportunity from plugins is much greater, 10 to 100 times greater in a world where these large language models exist, because you could imagine there's a whole bunch of different, tests or checks or types of generators or whatever that you might want to perform that, any one company is probably not going to invent all of them. Whereas, what would a plugin do at Google Docs in a world without this kind of AI? There's you can imagine some stuff, there's some plugins, but it's less obvious why there's a huge need for it. Also on the platform side, just like integrating with the CMS, right? Like the integration now is copy paste, and it's very error prone. There's lots of formatting errors and time spent fixing them that I think can be eliminated through. There's just a bunch of basic stuff there. But yeah, those are kind of key things.
Plugin platform, you're talking about other people would write plugins that would plug into this platform to help for more niche or vertical specific use cases?
Yeah, like the way that people write plugins for Figma, maybe one day they'll write plugins for Lex is the goal. Or the way that even just we write some functionality, we structure it as more of a plugin that not all users might want, but a subset would find incredibly valuable. And to have those show up when you're writing in a way that is intuitive and discoverable, but at the same time out of your way if it's not for you.
Right. So how closely coupled is the decision about those three categories, like the drafting, the review, and the platform? Are those kind of stuff that you'll prototype within because you run a media organization, right?
Yeah.
So like you kind of have kind of a good, patient zero type customer. Is that important to what you want to do or how you think about the process, or is it sort of like a totally separate thing?
Yeah, no, I mean, all of this comes out of, our experience at Every, right? Like the pains we run into just operating on top of Google Docs, right? So it's the first best customer idea, right?
And so how do you prioritize which of those three to go after? Do you just kind of pick off number one and start prototyping it, or like what is the actual process? Because you kind of have your 0 to 1 product philosophy. Now you're a little bit at the 1 to 100, and how does that process look when you're kind of patient zero?
I mean, I think I don't know about a sort of general framework for answering these questions. That would be an interesting thing to think through, but for at least this specifically, to me, it seems like the best idea to focus on the drafting experience first, and then the collaboration and feedback and review process, and then platform and ecosystem. And the reason why is if it's not a good drafting experience, you're not going to bother, sending anyone a Lex document to give you feedback. You're probably just going to keep using some other tool if you prefer to draft in that tool, right? And then if it's not a good place for, lots of people to collaborate on documents and teams to run on, then why would anyone have any motivation to build plugins or API integrations or whatever else? So there's some dependency, that sort of makes one build on top of the other is my way of thinking.
Yep. And so drafting, there's some way that drafting happens today within kind of the every organization, right? And do you think this is going to just be like augmenting that, or will it reshape? Like, are you just going to like be like, hey, instead of X that we used to do, we're going to do Y, and it's going to just look a lot different?
Yeah, it's going to be, instead of Google Docs, we're using Lex. And right now we pretty much are using Lex. I mean, it's up to the writer, like where they want to draft, but a lot of people have just, decided they like to write in Lex. And then when we need to do feedback, we just copy and paste into a Google Doc, and then there's track changes and comments and all that stuff. But, it was so funny last week when I was, actually this week, it feels like last week because it's been, what is time these days?
Quite a week.
When I was going through the edits that our editor put on my column, I was thinking a lot more about, like, I have this general idea that it kind of sucks, but like, what is it that makes it suck, I noticed, like, I can't keep my hands on the keyboard. Like, I have to hunt with my mouse to like click on a bubble on the right and then have it show a highlight in a deeper color of orange or yellow on the left, and then like parse it in my head and like accept it or reject it if it's a track change, or like respond to it and resolve it somehow if it's a comment, and then move on to the next one. And there's a lot of like disorientation that happens, and it feels very messy. And I think there's a way to make it feel much more sequential, linear, simpler, and to just keep your hands on the keyboard so you can move through the edits really quickly. So yeah, there's just a bunch of stuff like that. Some of it is related to AI, some of it's not, right? But yeah, over time, as that's good enough, organically, hopefully people in Every will decide, hey, I'm just going to send the link to my Lex document rather than copy and pasting it into a Google Doc for feedback. And, there's zero policy or pressure to use Lex because obviously no one else would create such a policy. So why would we,
Right.
Yeah.
And how does the, I know that I've been sort of a little bit deeper in the YouTube ecosystem these days, playing around with things and learning from people there. And one thing I've heard again and again in YouTube video creation is people always write the title and make the thumbnail first. And I remember when we did the piece with you guys about a year ago, we ended up just kind of like, I think you and I were DMing about it, about the concept, and then we wrote a thing, and then we kind of had this workshop to create the title within the Every Slack. I think there was a bunch of. Yeah. So I wonder, how do you think about title creation and even just like concept creation? Because that's a little bit even upstream of drafting, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, no, totally. It's so important. It's interesting that you say in the YouTube world, a lot of people create the title and the thumbnail first. Like, are you saying before they create the video, or like once? That's so fascinating.
A lot of big creators say the very first thing you do, come up with an idea for a video you want to make, and then first, before you make the video, make the thumbnail and make the title. Write the title. Figure out like what is going to be. It's effectively kind of like the hook.
Yeah, the hook. Yeah. That's fascinating. I feel like it's the opposite in writing, at least for me. And now I'm tempted to try it the other way, but I always have to write it, figure out what it is, and then figure out how to sell it, kind of. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that it's cheaper to write. Like, you don't have to, do anything other than sit at your computer and tap on keys, like, whereas with video, you got to like plan out, like, I mean, maybe not every type of video, but most videos you got to, there's more cost involved and planning involved, and it's less freeform. So maybe that's something to do with it, but, I much prefer to just write and then figure out how to sell it at the end. I mean, of course, when you start writing, there's got to be some saleable concept in your head, right? And I think there's a lot that AI can do to help with that. One of the ideas I'm most excited about is right now when you chat with AI, like ChatGPT was just released, and people have been building chatbots, including Lex, on GPT-3 for a while now. I'm really excited about the idea of asking the AI to prompt you rather than you prompting the AI.
Yep.
And have the AI sort of like pull things out of you that are like this. If you have a good conversation with like a great developmental editor or like a ghostwriter, even like, what do they ask? and how do they use that information to come up with something good? And like, can you teach the AI or prompt the AI somehow to get the AI to do that? Exactly how that works its way into the UI, I don't know yet, but I think it's a really exciting possibility, because one of the hardest things for people is just, especially when you're new, is to sort of drive the process, right? You don't know what to do. So to get the AI to drive the process a little bit more for you, I think could unlock a lot for a lot of people, and it could serve as sort of like a set of training wheels for getting into writing.
Right.
That's really cool. It almost combines concepts from like GPT-3 based mental health, or, you know, like there's a little bit of the life coach almost element there. It's like writing coach, like what are things that you've been thinking about recently? Really, like which one is your favorite one? What do your friends talk about? I don't know what the guiding questions would be, but like if you're literally stuck and have no idea what to write, blank page. I mean, there's probably also interesting stuff where you could like integrate into someone's Twitter followers or something, and or who they're following. What are they talking about? Right now everyone's obsessed with like nuclear activity and policy, blah blah blah. Like maybe you should write about that, because
totally.
You also wrote about kind of riding technology waves in one of your pieces, and it reminds me of like writers have to do that too, but it's often tricky to figure out what waves apply to what audiences and like where exactly to put yourself.
Totally. I think that's exactly right. And I would even say in general, we're in a phase with the way that people interact with a lot of AI that I think is not going to last, which is you start with a blank text area. I think the vast majority of the sort of use cases that'll become durable will be something to react to as a person. The AI is asking you a question or presenting you with some information, and then you can interact with it to go deeper, or you can respond to it based on what it's asking you, but you don't have to start with a blank text area and then just be like, what do I want to ask it to do? Like, you know, in the style of the King James Bible, describe a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in a VCR or whatever. Like, that's kind of like funny, but I think most successful experiences don't start with something blank usually, you know? There's just so much friction. Blank is, I'm bouncing, you know? So yeah.
Are there examples of people working on stuff like that right now?
I'm sure. I can't think of anything on the top of my head, but well, I mean, there's lots of little examples, right? So like with image generation, right? One version of it is it's a blank text box that you type something in, but then you see like AI avatar or AI interior design or whatever as like even just the branding of the thing. Conceptually, there's a starting point. So it's got some specific promise that you're like, you know what to do. You upload a photo of yourself or of a room or multiple photos, and then it goes from there. And I think there's a reason why those are succeeding really well. And it's not to say that the sort of like start from scratch isn't succeeding. It's just that that's like a lower level thing, right? When someone has an organic idea for something they want to type in one of those blank text boxes, then it's great, and that'll always be useful. But I do think that there will be specific promises that like suggest more logical starting points or specific values. That trying to think of other good examples.
I mean, it points to a broader topic that I think that I've been sort of making the claim is that I think a lot of these AIs, because they're so, you know, very efficient platform, but they're going to become like very useful. Like a GPT-3 or GPT-4 is going to become very useful to lots of people in so many cases. But the actual like value at the application layer is probably going to be some human interaction around that. And so this prompting thing, it's like I could go to Twitter, find a tweet, and decide to like use that tweet from myself or somebody else to initiate a bunch of creativity that then I can sort of, I've got the conversation going from a tweet. Right. You could actually imagine new networks and services where the output of that actually feeds into those inputs. So example, have you played with this one that Suhail is doing, is playgroundai.com? I
haven't played with it yet, but I saw that he was working on that now. That's cool.
So it's something of like, if I can, I don't even know, it's probably not the right way to say it, but it's something like a, you know, Twitter for generated AI images. So you can just show up and I can see like, oh, what did Nathan make? What queries did he use? What images did that generate? And that could inspire me with an idea of a direction I want to go.
Love it. Yeah, no, I think it makes perfect sense, and we're gonna see. It's just this is the cool thing about it is it's not like you know, one type of application or whatever. It's like a feature that gets built into every application. Yeah. You know, in a bunch of different ways, right? Not just one way into all applications. Like mobile was kind of like, okay, now everything also works on this thing that you can carry in your pocket.
Right.
And it's kind of like it enables some things that are totally new, and then there's a lot of other things that just have a new version that fits inside this new space. Whereas AI, it's like a much more open-ended and creative surface area, how it can change all of the products we use on a daily basis. So I think that's what's so exciting about it, is it does sort of feel like more similar to, I mean, just like the emergence of like the web or something like that, where it's so open-ended and creative, like what can be done with it.
Yeah.
I think as builders, and designers, it's more interesting in a lot of ways than mobile, which is like kind of weird to think about, right? Because it's mobile is such a huge wave. Like, just because it's more interesting doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be more valuable. But
is the more interesting because mobile was just adaptation for the most part in your mind? It was adaptation of the web instead of kind of as much de novo?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the experience of doing your email on your phone is like valuable for sure, but it's less like, oh wow, that's totally different, Right. And there were definitely some things on mobile that were totally different, but it's more of just like, it's a convenience factor, hugely valuable.
Right.
But it's the same kind of stuff you were doing, just now you can do it anywhere with the thing that you've got in your pocket. Whereas with AI, it's like you're doing different kind of stuff now. You're interacting with a computer in a whole different way, and it's not just going to be one different thing. It's going to be a lot of different things. Like imagine, what is the new version of like email, or text messages, or DMs, or whatever, or even reading, right? Like I wrote this article, the Infinite article, where it's like, what if you had sort of like an AI agent, right? That's like reading everything on the internet and knows what you're interested in and knows what kind of stuff you're working on, and gives you a brief that's like customized, custom generated just for you. That's like, hey, like, good morning. Here's some of the top things. Like, let me know which one you want to hear more about. And you go deeper and you can ask it questions. And it's like, as if you had a personal assistant who's providing like, the equivalent of like the president's like White House morning briefing or whatever. It's like interactive, it's personalized, and you can like ask questions, all that stuff. But it's like for everyone, for whatever's important in your life, So I just think there's so many things like that seem like science fiction, but really will emerge over the next couple of years.
Right. And are you more bullish on the kind of startup, new opportunities here, or do you think like the incumbents will extend these AI tools effectively, or kind of where's your split on that?
I think it's going to be both. Like incumbents are going to be able to leverage it where they can. There's also going to be opportunities that make more sense for startups, and the devil's in the details, and also in some degree of randomness of like, where is world-class execution by startups being applied, or world-class execution by big companies. Is not it's a factor that's not easy to predict, but it is really important because there's a scarce amount of energy and talent, and where it gets applied matters a lot. Of course, there's some degree of like maybe there's like a subpar effort that uncovers that something is interesting, and then someone else can come in and they've sort of seen that it's valuable and they do a really well executed version of it. Right. But so to some degree, maybe there's some inevitability about the way that it shapes out, because smart people will see the early signals or whatever. But I do think that there's it's going to be both, and it's going to be extremely dependent on the very particular circumstances in every single kind of like industry or competitive kind of like job to be done. That companies are competing to win, to be hired by consumers for, or end users.
Right. How do you think about the sort of the platforms that you work with to kind of do the heavy lifting on AI versus the application layer? So I think you had the Lex chat, since the beginning of Lex, or recently.
It was like a week or two after launch.
Okay, yeah. I recall it being kind of part of it for a long time, and then GPT chat was just announced or released more publicly in the last few days, I think. So
I think it was like yesterday or maybe the day before.
Yeah. So clearly that's like, some platform opportunity that you kind of gave a demonstration of how it could be used and done. And then they sort of did a more, horizontal version of that. So how do you think about sort of the interplay between applications and platforms there?
Yeah, it's going to be an extremely productive relationship, I think. Because I think it's clear, like, at least for now, right? Like at some point it might shift, right? But for the next probably couple years, there's going to be companies like, Stability and OpenAI that their business model is to have great, tools that can be used in a lot of different ways. And then there's going to be, lots of existing companies and new companies that are finding ways to put use to those tools. And of course, when you find a way, then as an application developer, that is information that feeds back into the way that the models get created. And also, I think literally there's probably like data feedback loops that feed back into how the models perform, And so I think it'll be really collaborative for a while, where it's kind of similar to, how like the PC industry came together. It's like, oh wow, like, mobile's a thing. Like let's make these CPUs much more battery efficient. How can we do that? And then the more efficient battery usage you get, the better the phones get, the more people buy it, then this feedback loop works. And I think it's running extremely hot right now with generative AI, and will keep running that way probably for a while. It's interesting to consider what the limit is. It seems like we're probably fairly close to the limit for just pure like how much text or images or whatever, like training data can you input? And the next big opportunity is sort of like how the models are actually constructed, and what the techniques to make use of that training data. And I think also we still have a long way to go on that. It just seems, I'm not like a full, obviously, expert, but listening to people who are, it seems like even at some point we could probably or would probably move past like the transformer, which is the key thing that is powering a whole current wave and is not running out anytime soon. It's not clear that that's like the end state of all generative AI. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. And is Lex going to, do you imagine a near future or far future where Lex has its own AI models, or is Lex going to be a UX on top of kind of existing AI tools, or kind of the frontier on AI research and computation will be pushed by these other platforms, and you'll focus on UX, or do you think that you get into that part of it in a more vertical way too?
Yeah, I think the bigger Lex gets, the more sense it makes to sort of work our way backwards a little bit, but maintaining, the sort of like stance of like we're solving a specific problem for a specific set of users. But maybe as we get bigger, we have more resources, and it's clear that we could use those resources to develop better specific solutions for our users' specific problems, So like, and also I think that it's going to be increasingly like a mix, right? It's not just going to be one model that powers everything. It's going to be like kind of how I was explaining before with the platform. Like you can imagine if you're writing a really precise, like logical argument, there's one type of model you might want to run on your text to sort of check for non sequiturs or fallacies or whatever. And if you're doing a completely different type of like, more personal writing or fiction or something like that, maybe there's different things. Like you want to have a model that checks for what are all the, of the five senses, like what kind of sensory detail are you, like, are you painting a picture with this writing, or is it just kind of like abstract? And so I think maybe some of those will maybe some of those will be sort of like integrated with models that came from elsewhere. I don't really know how it's going to play out, but I definitely think there's going to be more like different models that are, tools that you pick up when you have different circumstances.
Yeah, that was one thing that I found interesting to think about as well. Like, how do tools for different writings really start specializing? Like there's Pseudowriting, and I think that sort of grew out of people who were passionate about writing like sci-fi short stories. Lex, maybe a lot of people on Every are doing more of the sort of like long form essay on tech, business, nonfiction topics. There's the marketing stuff of Jarvis, etc. News writing, maybe even. So I'm kind of curious, like I guess you have the most touch points with the stuff that people are doing with Every, obviously, and what you write every day. Are there gaps? Like you talked about the drafting process or thinking about ideas. Like what are the other most annoying parts right now, like that you wish you had more feedback on, or that you find most useful when like a human gives you feedback on, in your workshop groups or whatever, that could be built in there?
Yeah, I mean, and some of this doesn't even like, there's a bunch of cool ideas about how AI could give feedback, but there's also just like, It would be great if I could have like a standing group of people who have volunteered, like, hey, I'm interested in reading anything you're writing early that you want to publish. And I could click a button at a certain point in the process, or maybe multiple points in the process, and have an email go out to those people and be like, hey, if you're interested, you know, you got 24 hours, like, and then and read this and leave feedback. And like, how would you actually structure that experience? You know, does it look just like add a comment or leave a track change or whatever? Or are there different ways to ask people for feedback? For instance, like I kind of love this framework for assessing a piece of writing, like what's awesome, what's boring, what's confusing, and what do you not believe, don't believe, right? So ABCD. You know, what if when you highlighted a piece of text, it was kind of like it gave you one of those four things and the ability to optionally leave a note, right? And you could view as the writer sort of like a heat map of your writing. That kind of stuff, you know, which would make it a lot easier to incorporate feedback from like 20 people, is really valuable, right? And like, it's the kind of thing where, is Google Docs going to build that? Like, I don't think so. So anyway, I'm excited. I'm really excited for just like what to play with using AI and not. Like, how can you make the whole experience of writing and publishing better?
Right. Yeah. You talked about the URL as sort of maybe the goal of a lot of the writing that you want to serve with Lex. And it reminds me a bit of, did we ever talk about the Chris Payek kind of living document blog posty thing?
Oh, I don't know if I saw this.
He published these Google Doc blog posts on Twitter. And so there would be like 100 people on at the same time. You could see them all viewing and people would be commenting in line. So it's kind of like he didn't publish it anywhere else. Like that was the post. Yeah. But you can still go back and see all of the history of comments and stuff, which is kind of cool.
That is cool. Yeah, no, I think something like that could be really cool. I mean, I'm less interested in being the place that people publish as I am in the place that, you know, it like integrates into where you publish, because there's a whole set of other things like, you know, distribution and making money and all that kind of stuff that probably people have their own solution for that right now. That's pretty good. But it is cool to think about, like, you know, especially in the context of like early readers, more like as a part of the feedback process rather than like in the once it's published process, having different ways to structure like what is the feeling of like having 100 people live looking at the same document, and how can they what if maybe even it's not like a 100% trusted group, right? Like, can you structure it where, like, you know, it's kind of like gas, right, or TBH, where it's like impossible to say anything bad or whatever, but you can just say different types of good, which give people information. But the only possible information is positive, basically. Maybe there's something like that, or maybe you want some slight strategic negative, but it's like very tactful or whatever, like, you know, confusing or boring or whatever. Like when you're actually getting feedback on a draft, you want it to be kind of like brutally honest versus just people wanting compliments or whatever. Yeah, that's funny. They should. I just realized that is the whole demand for gas, is people like to be complimented. They should call it phishing. Phishing.
That's really cool, because it points to. I mean, like, you talked about reading as well, and everyone always complains about Goodreads, and what you're pointing at is almost like the writing. I mean, Twitter isn't really this, I don't think, but like the writing social. What's the writing social web? If I had a text go out to, or a Twitter DM group get created every time I had a draft, of which I have like a million drafts of essays and that I haven't published yet, like it would just be so much more dynamic. And I feel like people, like, that is the reason to write or publish something, is that high for me, like when something finally gets out. But if you could just like give people that high at like stage 0.5 instead of weeks down the line, I think that's super powerful. I think it would get people creating a lot more too.
Yeah, I think naturally there is a sort of iterative high. I feel like I get the same type of thrill, like the same quality of it when I hit publish as I do when I send a draft and someone's like, this was great. Like it's the exact same thing. And it's also the same in product building, by the way. When you send someone a private beta that's like a friend of yours or even a teammate, right? Like you build a feature and you're like, can you try this? You know, like even if it's like a programmer that has to like, you know, pull from Git the new branch and run it locally to try it or whatever, that is a form of publishing, right? You're getting a first reaction. And I do definitely think pulling that earlier in the process with a friendlier group and reducing the friction to it is a really powerful thing. Also, it's not bad for the K factor either. So I'm excited to get that going. We got to get like actual, you know, have comments and all that kind of stuff first. But I do think that'll be a really good really good feature to build.
Yeah, I think there's actually an interesting slippery slope here. So I understand why you are saying I don't want to be the place where you publish, because there's lots of tools and monetization, audience stuff. So I get that. I think that's like a very rational perspective. But I think there's actually also a slippery slope that if you help people build the draft and help people get their early feedback, maybe in the future most internet documents should be much more interactive. Like maybe we shouldn't have the moment of publish, and it should just be the moment of like, I shared it with 5 people to get feedback, and then it kind of like got more feedback from more people, and it kind of found its own home, and it still lives. It was published a year ago, but like there's still people who contribute to it every day and disagree with it. Almost a Wikipedia like publishing process, which I think you're actually touching on these themes in an interesting way, even though you're saying I don't want to go there.
Yeah. No, I think there's something to that, right? So like, there's a lot of people who, Notion is not really built to be a publishing platform, but they share a link to a Notion page, right?
Yep.
And so, or like a lot of people share links to Google Docs publicly, right? Usually it's the view only mode, but Google Docs are not. It's not crazy to share a link or to get a link to it.
Right.
I think it just depends on what you're doing, right? So like, if you just need a place to have text show up somewhere, then yeah, I mean, and Lex currently has a view only link that people can share and have shared, on Twitter and stuff like that. I just don't want to get in the business of, get an email list and send out an email when there's a new post and have payments. Like the whole Substack thing is like, they do that very well. The people like Every or, other like kind of publications that have their own custom CMS or whatever, like they're going to want to keep those. So, but I do think that for certain use cases, it'll like definitely there should be a way to share a link to, and there is a way to share a link to a Lex page.
Yeah.
And can you instigate new writing that otherwise might not occur because people are afraid, or they don't have an audience yet, or like they're not sure if what they're writing is interesting enough, so they kind of like write the title or they write the first paragraph and enough people chime in that they decide to write a second paragraph or whatever.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, the thing I have also been super attracted to the idea of more writing should feel more Wikipedia-ish, right? There should be better ways or incentives to create documents that you just maintain over time.
Yep.
I think the challenge is it's very hard to have traffic flow to a thing in an ongoing way. Basically, the only way is to show up at the top of Google for whatever query is the thing that people want when they want what you have in that document. Winning SEO is really, really hard. You have to sort of like build a whole operation around it, and it's not something that one person can just sort of like do, basically. And so then you're basically stuck with type of writing, which is what all of us sort of have defaulted to invisibly, guided by these forces without even realizing why we write the kind of things we write, which is you have the same group of people that reads your stuff over and over again, and you just need a new thing for them, like every week or every day or every month or whatever your cadence is. And, once someone reads something, they're probably not going to go back and read it again. And they're probably not going to remember like, oh, this, had the perfect guide to this problem I have. So I'm going to navigate directly to that page, to that site and find that page. There are exceptions. Like I think Lenny does an amazing job at this he publishes new stuff to the same audience on a recurring, regular basis, but at the same time, he's built a very specific brand and it is all evergreen. And so if you, are in his audience and you have a specific type of problem, you might think to yourself, I bet Lenny has something on this. And he often does, right? So it's really good. And I think it's part of the reason why he has such a powerful subscription business is because if you can kind of like create a guidebook almost that's like a living guidebook for a certain type of person who has certain type of problems, then that's great. But, by default, it's a lot easier. And what most of us do is just, comment on what's happening currently or something like that. And so, at Every, we're definitely trying to get more into the, like, that's part of the reason for the post about like my philosophy of product building is like, I hope that it's the kind of thing where over time, Every can provide the structure that will get people to be able to go back to it on a recurring basis, maybe make it show up in Google for certain searches, but also just people will remember Every and think, I bet they have something about this and have that work. The same way it happens with Lenny. There's
Does Lenny have like an on-site search process, or you think people just go to Google and query with his name to try to find some article they suspect may exist?
Probably both. Substack has search. Fun fact, I actually built the very first version of that, which was terrible, and it's much better now. But Substack has search, so he does have that.
Yeah. That's super interesting. Have you played with Curious?
No, what's Curious? I like
It's
the name. I'm curious.
I think it's curious.app, curious.app, or .xyz, maybe.
Oh,
but it's
wait,
basically
well, .app is a read with your friends thing. Is this what you're talking about?
yes.
Okay.
But one thing that's cool, I was just thinking of that when you were mentioning some of this stuff around like resurfacing information and like pinging your friends when you write something. I feel like you could somehow like crawl what your friends had been tweeting about or writing their drafts about or even consuming and sort of like use that in the drafting process a little bit, or like it does become a better search at some point, right? If you because one thing that frustrated me for forever about writing on the internet is just like the sort of like blank page, empty room problem. Whereas if I'm walking through a museum with someone, or I'm walking through a library with someone, or I'm like having something to react to in that way, it's probably going to be, it's still going to be curated by someone, right? Like the public spaces of the NYPL or like whatever are still curated by someone. So we're reacting to something in the same way that like an algorithm might curate what we react to. But just like, how can you make that as socially informed as possible? Because that's what people talk about when they talk about vibes, right? Like there's a vibe of people that's like the tools for thought person, like Andy Matuszak and Michael Nielsen. And like, it's like very easy to identify like tribes and in that sense. But, and like sort of, if you look around and look at their feeds and what they're reading and writing, you can probably think of, oh, maybe I should write about this. But it's a really like, you have to have probably like a bunch of months on Twitter and have figured out these social circles already, and then you're finally like understanding where that all pans out.
Yeah, I know. I think the general challenge of discovering cool things is going to be really interesting to watch, because it's sort of been stale, I think, for like a long time. The main new thing that was exciting that happened is like, I don't know, I guess the For You page on TikTok, and then maybe like Spotify playlists or something, which is like not that different from like a Pandora radio station. It's just more navigable or discoverable or whatever. And
do you think we'll see something like the TikTok For You page for writing?
Maybe. I mean, that was one idea I've been super excited about for is like, what if it's a daily email that is everybody gets a different thing every day, you know, and we've got this huge library of stuff, and some of it's super fresh and you want to get it because it's new, and some of it is evergreen but still super relevant, and we can kind of run a calculation that for each user, for each day, what's the best thing for them to see. So first of all, have you already seen it? Okay, then we shouldn't send it to you. How relevant is it still? If it's old and it's not an evergreen post, it gets downranked. How related is it to topics that you've already expressed that you like or whatever? Building that actual system is super hard, and it's not obvious that it performs like way better in the early stages. But if you have enough data and you have enough posts, and you can kind of, I think there's a way to do something like that. Within Every, I think it makes sense because there's a baseline. Like all of it is good, you know. There's nothing that's like, you know, like spam or what, like, you know, it's all at least okay, right? But the problem is like okay is not good enough. It's got to be like the best thing for your attention at any point in time. Otherwise, you'll stop paying attention. And we've found generally that for now, it's better to just basically focus all our energy on creating one thing that's great each day, and then sending that to everyone, and it works out, rather than having a whole bunch of variety of different things and having different people get different things. It just didn't end up panning out as well for now. I do think that someone could do something like that potentially, or it could go somewhere within Every one day. But yeah, it's fascinating to think about, you know, like what, and also just what changes with AI. To me, the more exciting thing though with how AI could change it is less recommending links and more creating new stuff for you based on an understanding of what's in all those links.
Right. And so that's the creating new stuff is sort of kind of back to your personal assistant type thing where it browses everything, consumes what you would want to do and summarizes it and gives you sort of all of that stuff linked.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an exciting idea.
Yeah.
Definitely. Free idea if anybody's
Yeah.
looking for a project.
I know we are coming up to the end of the hour, but we were going to ask you a little bit about your product philosophy, and maybe you do have some free ideas for people, because in the product philosophy, you're encouraging people to just kind of get started and just write something that you want. And people might not understand the scope of how small something can be and still be useful. So I wonder if you have any other ideas that you'd like to see built, you wanted to play with, but you haven't had the sort of, you're busy with lots of different things.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one that I came really close to wanting to build, but I just felt would be a little bit too difficult is I would love for something to connect with my Gmail and run an algorithm on all my messages to see, is this a newsletter or not? Like reading material, basically, like a real newsletter, not like a marketing thing, and then sort those all into their own folder and, get them out of my main inbox, and then have an app that's like a better way for me to read all those things. Cause I think the way you would design a reading app is different than the way you would design an email app. Mm-hmm. And the people who have done this before, have done it where it's like you get a new email address and you have to re-sign up for all your newsletters or whatever. It doesn't work. And then you still have all your old newsletters like in your inbox. So it doesn't really solve any real problems. I think it just kind of creates problems. There's just way too much activation cost. But I think the right way to do it is just to give it access to my email. But the problem is people's emails are obviously sensitive. And so you have to be extremely privacy conscious. And especially if you're training an AI on is this a newsletter or not to classify, how do you train that AI on people's emails in a way that preserves their privacy? There are techniques, and this is where I ended up deciding not to do it, but there's a thing called federated learning where you can have the learning happen at all the edges, and then it can feed sort of like ones and zeros of the weight, the parameters and weights or whatever, back to the central algorithm, and which it can then sort of distribute back out to all the other edges as it learns. But that's complicated, and it's that one is a little bit less tractable. But if you're excited about building a version of that, even if you don't think you can solve that, I would encourage you to do it, because even if you just get as far as okay, can I set up a server that I can connect with my Gmail and that has access to my email? That's a cool first step, right? And then you're well, can I just train it on my own emails, right? That could be interesting. There's all sorts of ways to do that. That's how far I got. I set up a Rails app that could OAuth with a Google account, actually multiple Google accounts, so you could sort of aggregate from all your different, your work and your personal email or whatever, and trained an algorithm on Hugging Face to based on I built an interface that would let me with one keystroke Y or N tell the training data, create training data of this is a newsletter, this is not, and then I fed that training data into Hugging Face, and they auto trained 100 models, and I picked the one that was the highest performing, and it worked super well. It was
wow,
holy shit, you can actually, without any real machine learning knowledge, just some basic create some process to create training data, have an algorithm that works pretty well. I think newsletters versus other types of emails are pretty detectable. There's probably some common patterns, this is just a whole bunch of paragraphs versus it's a lot of images, or it's short text, and there's probably also signatures in the way that the HTML is formatted and all that kind of stuff that are easy for an algorithm to pick up on. But anyway, I would definitely encourage people just to get started, because even if you decide to stop, I learned a lot about the Gmail API, about Hugging Face, about, and so this is why it's so important not to get, like I was saying before, myopically focused on this is the one thing, and it's only worth it if this thing becomes a business or pays off or whatever. But instead to think of it as you're training yourself, right? And you're just going, and it would be like if you never worked out, but you only wanted to do battle or something like that. It's no, you got to do push-ups or do sword play with friendly, if you want to be a knight or whatever. So you have to do things like that in order to be able to build real things when the occasion, calls for it. I think it's important not to overthink it and just start, do step one.
LARPing is okay.
LARPing is totally, everybody has to LARP, Yeah.
That's great. Well, I know we're past the hour, and it's been super great to reconnect. It's been so long. Let's not, we don't have to let 2 years go by before our next video.
Yeah, no, this has been awesome. Thanks for inviting me on. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks. So good to see you again.
All right. We'll see you, Nathan.
See ya. Bye.
Bye.